Here we have Abzan Control in Modern. This is not a new deck of the format, but it's been surging in popularity recently. Abzan was actually the most popular Modern deck choice at the World Championships. It's got a lot of game against just the Modern format in general. It's a mid-range deck, so it can attack other decks in various ways. It has a lot of answers. This is my version, the exact 75 I played at the World Championships, and it's a little bit different from the more typical versions we're seeing out there right now. So looking at the mana base, there's only 2 copies of Shambling Vents, and then there's a bunch of lands that help enable us to cast turn 1 Noble Hierarch and then a turn 2 copy of Liliana. So if you're able to play a turn 2 Liliana, it's just fantastic for this deck. And a lot of the Abzan lists actually don't play Noble Hierarch at all, but I'm playing the full 4 here because Noble Hierarch is just one of the most powerful cards in the format. And since I'm playing the 4 Noble Hierarchs, you can play less discard spells. There's only 3 Inquisitions and then 1 copy of Thoughtseize in the main, plus 1 copy of Collective Brutality, which can serve a number of purposes, not just as being a discard spell. But there's also a bunch of fetch lands for Overgrown Tombs because you really want that black-green land on turn 1 and turn 2. And there's 4 copies of Path's Exile. Path's Exile is still really good. It takes care of a lot of troublesome creatures, including all of the Eldrazi cards, and Bant Eldrazi is a very popular deck. So I'll talk about how you can actually configure this deck in a way that it's pretty solid against Bant Eldrazi. 4 copies of Tarmogoyf. Tarmogoyf is staple card in Modern. You've got discard spells, you've got Planeswalkers, you've got a variety of card types in your deck. So it's pretty likely to be a huge 2-mana threat. And then 2 Scavenging Ooze. Scavenging Ooze is here as a way of having a main deck option for disrupting your opponent's graveyard, and it's also just a value card later in the game. You can gain some life with it. It does some different things. Sometimes you'll definitely board it out. But there's a bunch of high-powered 3-mana cards because we've got those Noble Hierarchs, so you can play these 3-mana cards on turn 2 potentially. So Lingering Souls, absolutely fantastic. Great against a bunch of decks, from Infect to Affinity to any type of control deck to the Mirror. Lingering Souls is just great. Painful Truce is a card that I like right now because it's good in the Mirror and other grindy matchups. And there's spots where just drawing 3 cards is so good. There's also a 3-2 split with Liliana the Veil and also Liliana the Last Hope. There's going to be matchups where one is better than the other, but Liliana the Veil still good against combo decks, against when your opponent just has 1 creature in play. You can make them sacrifice it. You can also tick it up, and then you're able to discard a Lingering Souls or discard a card you don't want. And so there's 3 of those. You can only play so many Lilianas because you can't have multiples of them in play, of course. Liliana the Veil is the normal Planeswalker, but Liliana the Last Hope, it gets rid of the... there's actually a lot of 1 toughness creatures in Modern, believe it or not. You can just immediately get rid of them while ticking up, going up to 4 loyalty while you're getting rid of your opponent's creature. Alternatively, you can go down with it. You can mill a card like Lingering Souls, which can then be flashed back, or you can just mill a creature or have a creature already in the graveyard to get back with Liliana the Last Hope. So it works quite nicely. Both are very good. Both are even better the earlier you can cast them. Now, there's also 3 copies of Siege Rhino. Personally, just a huge fan of Siege Rhino. The life drain and life loss are both important for the deck. I know some versions of Abzan have been shaving or even cutting Siege Rhino, but the 3 copies here have been very good for me. So I'm pretty happy with the creature base overall. There's also 1 copy of Tireless Tracker, which is another way of drawing cards later in the game, and there's a bunch of fetch lands in the deck. So a lot of the time you play the Tireless Tracker, then play a fetch land. All of a sudden you have 2 clues, and then even if your opponent gets rid of it, as we know from Standard, Tireless Tracker is just a huge way of drawing cards. Now you can get back these creatures with Liliana the Last Hope, so it's all kind of a piece of the puzzle here. We've got some removal in the deck that can get rid of not just creatures. So Path to Exile, Murderous Cut, those are just, alright, we're going to kill a dude with those cards. But Abrupt Decay and Maelstrom Pulse are a lot more versatile. There's a lot of troublesome permanents in Modern beyond just creatures, and so we've got Decay and Pulse to just be all-purpose removal spells, even though sometimes they cost a little bit more in terms of mana than the other removal options. So this is the main deck, 22 lands, 4 Noble Hierarchs, and it's worked pretty well for me. Sideboard here, we've got some additional removal. Slaughter Pact is a spot removal spell against any deck with Become Immense or Affinity. It's just great. Engineered Explosives similarly is good against these Go Wide decks, and it also can get rid of any permanent, similar to an Abrupt Decay Maelstrom Pulse effect. Thoughtseize, because we're only playing 4 discard spells in the main, which is less than most versions, so we've got a couple more on the board to shore up those combo matchups. Rest in Peace is a card where when you board it in, you board out a lot of your graveyard synergy cards, like your Tarmogoyfs and stuff like that. But that's fine, because when you're boarding in Rest in Peace completely shuts down your opponent's entire deck. Like, if you're boarding in against Living End, if you're boarding in against Dredge, it's just game over when you play it, so it doesn't really matter that it's shutting off some of your other cards. It's that powerful of an effect. Now, personally, I like having a good affinity matchup, and this deck does absolutely have a good affinity matchup, and part of that is because of the sideboard. 3 copies of Stony Silence. There's also 1 copy of Creeping Corrosion, so I wanted at Worlds to be able to crush Affinity. Unfortunately, I didn't play it against it there, but I feel very confident that Abzan, at least this version of Abzan, has a very strong Affinity matchup. There's 1 more copy of Painful Truce. Comes in against any deck that you think is going to be a grindy matchup, meaning it's going to go multiple turns. They're not trying to combo you on turn 4. And then we've got our Warships. Worship is fantastic in a number of spots. It's like against Merfolk or against Bant Eldrazi. There's a bunch of decks where you play it and it's almost impossible for your opponent to come back. Maybe they're looking for 1 card in their deck, but it completely warps how a game plays out if you have Worship in play. And sometimes it is just game over. Especially if you have Sigarda, Host of Herons, the one of in the sideboard. It's a hexproof threat, so your opponent basically can't deal with it without some sort of Wrath of God type thing. And it also stops your opponent from going ahead and using Liliana the Veil to make you sacrifice creatures. So Sigarda, Host of Herons is a card that I like. It's not in most lists, but 5/5 flying hexproof with additional text. It turns out is pretty good. So this is my list. Abzan, it can definitely lose to pretty much a lot of decks, but it can also beat a lot of decks. So if that's the type of mid-range decks you're looking for, I think Abzan is the best mid-range deck in Modern, and I would like to play some games with it.